Welcome, everyone. So we're doing Changing Narratives. We have Monica Kristen Blair from the Hopkins Retrospective. We have Kenneth Lepertito, am I saying it right? Lepertito, I'm sorry, who's from Florida International University. And then there's Michelle Wright, Shades of Hilton, and Shades of the Hilton. It's the Hilton. There's more to the name, though, right? The Hilton.
Shades of Hilton is the project, but I'm from Baltimore.
And Community College of Baltimore County. As I said, this is the changing narratives, and when I consider that, and so much that is, as Martha and others have pointed out, so much that's gone on in recent years have really been about that. And I mean, I think of it in terms of when you're changing, the way the narratives have changed, I think, is to provide a more truthful narrative, a more complete narrative, have more voices participating in bringing that narrative. That's been so important in so many ways. And here, as we talk about history and the history of enslaved people, and parts of the history and the meaning of symbols, Confederate statues, and more discussion, and all the debate and discussion about the flying of the Confederate flag. So much of that has sort of, there's been a narrative that many of us have been around and grew up with. And for some of it, it can really be personal. So I think about, for example, all the discussion now about the changing of the names on military installations. So my dad was career Army. He served, he was stationed for times at Fort Bragg, named after a Confederate general and slaveholder. He served at Fort Campbell. My brother followed him into the military and served at Fort Hood. So I think about this sort of bitter, what I see as a bitter contradiction. Black American soldiers serving their country, serving at bases that were named for people who fought to keep them enslaved. The history, I think about my own time spent at Fort Bragg at a time when, so not far from the base, if anyone's been to Fayetteville or was in Fayetteville during those years, there was a large billboard in Fayetteville with the Hooded Horsemen, join and support the United Klans of America. That was there for years. I can remember my dad always keeping a .45 stuck in the Buick, sort of jammed in there like that. Years later, I asked him about that. You know, whatever happened to that gun? Why'd you have it? He said, well, I kept it there because when I got to Bragg, I was told, and everyone knew, that sometimes deputy sheriffs or state troopers would pull over black soldiers to arrest them or rough them up. So he was prepared in case something like that happened. I had a great conversation with Ron last night after the event, and it was meant to happen because I just happened to mention having worked at the Banner, pardon me, on a commentary about black migration in Baltimore, and it just happened that he was the Baltimore Magazine writer and editor who worked on just a great piece that I came across, really informative, great piece that he had done some years before. So there's so much and you'll excuse me as I go along because I always got like quotes hanging around that I like to drop in. Carl Jung said, the reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories. We've seen that play out in so many ways. I think about the massacre of black people in Tulsa, and reading that people who were born and raised there and lived in that community for generations, black and white, didn't know the history. For a lot of reasons, the history was hidden, or was hidden from them. There's so many stories like that, and I think we arrived at a time. I came to call it, and friends and colleagues found that I made up a word, all at onceness. 2020 would be marked by all at onceness. There was a time and an opportunity to start changing narratives, to bring more truth, I would say, and completeness to a lot of narratives. So I guess I'd like to start there. Michelle, if you don't mind, I'll start from this end. Talk about institutionally. Talk about at your organization, what's been the approach of sort of the idea of I guess reckoning with history. How has that worked at Hilton?
Okay. Well, first I want to thank Martha for inviting me to be here. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful program. And before I start on the question that you asked, I just want to say that I wanted to acknowledge one of the hardest histories that every one of us have to deal with every day is the fact that we are all on stolen land. We are all on land that was taken away in a violent, brutal, 100-year process, and that we need to acknowledge that hard history in everything that we look at, and see it through that lens simultaneously while we're looking at it at other things as well. So I just wanted to sort of call that in as an acknowledgement of the indigenous populations, and the many that were lost as a result of that. Now, to answer your question, at the Community College of Baltimore County, we have 6 campuses, and I am doing the history on the Catonsville campus. So that is in the southwestern part of the county, of Baltimore County. And as a history professor, I was asked when they renovated the mansion there, $4 million renovation of the mansion. I won't go into my feelings about that, but you know, would I look at the history of the African descended people who were there? Well, this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm still working on this project. And so what I've been doing, mostly on my own, but I have to say that my institution has been somewhat supportive of a lot of my research and a lot of the work that I've been doing, is trying to flesh out the African descended people who labored on that land. And the land that I'm talking about, that was called the Hilton Estate at that time, and there was never anyone named Hilton who lived there. It was Hilton because it was on a hill, and actually it was purported that you could see Annapolis and the dome in Annapolis all the way from Catonsville. And I guess back in the day you could. But there have been over 8 families that owned it, several more individuals that owned it. So I'm looking at individual families and the African descended people who labored on that land, laboring in 3 different forms of enslavement: agricultural enslavement, industrial enslavement, and equestrian enslavement. And I can talk a little bit more about equestrian enslavement if you want me to look at that. But also the free people of color who also toiled on that land as well. So it's not totally about the enslaved populations who were on that property. But the time period that I've been looking at already, it goes all the way back to 1630. So we're talking about a land grant from Lord Baltimore up to 1959, when the land was sold to Baltimore County to create a community college that would be there. So I'm looking at that time period all the way through. So we're talking about a couple 100 years. So it's different pockets of people and different experiences. So some of you may be familiar with the Dorsey family, from Dorsey's Forge, Alfred's Furnace. That was part of this land. The land went all the way from Catonsville to Elkridge. It was at different points in time over 3,000 acres worth of land that they owned. It was, and it's located on Rolling Road, so that tells the story right there that was tobacco, rolling into Elkridge Landing. In addition to that, we have the Galloway family, a Quaker family that were notorious slave traders. A lot of people think, well, Quakers never enslaved. Well, yeah, they did. And he brought in many enslaved people into the Annapolis port that then were sold throughout the whole colony of Maryland, because this was a pre-Revolutionary War, all the way up to the Glenn family, and I'm skipping a few, I'm hitting the highlights. The Glenn family, judges, newspaper owners, Confederate sympathizers. Most of these people lived in the city of Baltimore and summered in Catonsville in these huge homes there. So I'm looking at this history over the course of time. We just installed last year historical markers to commemorate different aspects that happened at different places in front of the barn, to talk about what equestrian enslavement was during the 19th century. Also, most of the land that was owned at the last portion, towards the end of the 19th, going into the 20th century, is now Patapsco Valley State Park. So if you go into Patapsco Valley State Park and you see different markers, there are mentions of many of the families that own this land that was known as Hilton Estate. So it's a big swath of land. But if you think about what they were able to accomplish with that land and how it was sold to different families and the amount of wealth that was created, it becomes important to determine who created that wealth for the families that resided in that big mansion. By the way, my office is in the ugly brown building next to the big mansion, so I get to look out my window and see this beautiful, and it is a beautiful mansion. I don't know, has anyone ever been on the campus to see the mansion? It's quite beautiful. And sometimes I give tours on the campus. I don't really deal with the mansion. The only thing I deal with the mansion is when we go in, and I say, yes, it's beautiful, but let me just show you the back stairs that are cramped and narrow and dark. And this is where the servants had to navigate with trays of food and laundry and everything else in order to keep this house running. So the last thing I just want to say, and I know as historians, a lot of people don't realize what historians do. They think we just find history and write it down and share it with everyone. But a big part of being a historian is being an interpreter. That the research I'm doing is not that I'm uncovering a lot of new stuff, but I'm taking the stuff that's been there and I'm trying to reinterpret it. And even though all of this history is written from a white male, high-class perspective, we can get glimpses of what else was happening during this time period and try and flesh out those individuals and tell their story about what happened over the course of those 200 years on that particular piece of land. So I'll stop there.
I'm particularly struck, that last part you said, and that for me is a strand that runs through so much of this. I think about the 1619, I think about the 1619 project, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, I've heard her say numerous times that it isn't as if she unearthed some, undiscovered history, some new information that wasn't always there to be read and studied. It just was in a lot of ways, you could say, I think, systematically kept from people. It was kept out of the narrative. It was, let's face it, I think many Americans, many of us, a lot of our history comes from popular culture. It came from Birth of a Nation. It came from John Wayne movies. That's such an important factor for us to acknowledge, that the information has kind of been around, and it has to do with who controlled the narrative, what was done with the history. McDonough School and Johns Hopkins, those are educational institutions that, for anyone who born and raised, grew up in Baltimore, we're very familiar with them. But I'm thinking there's a lot of history about the place, the founders of it that we weren't aware of. Kenneth, how in working with McDonough, how has, tell us about the work you've done there when it comes to the histories and reckoning with that history.
Sure. So I think one thing that my story about working with hard histories brings is that I'm not part of the institution. I'm not employed by McDonough School. I have no institutional connection to them. I'm a historian who was brought in from the outside to help them tell their story. And I think that is an important perspective. So I have to say at the outset, I don't speak for the McDonough School. I speak from my experience as a historian, working with them on a project to tell their narrative, but also to tell the truth. And that's sort of my professional commitment to telling the truth, which when you work as a historian coming from the outside, and I've worked with a number of institutions over my career, that relationship has to be established. And it doesn't always work. There are institutions that will avert their eyes from the truth if it becomes unpleasant. So the fact that I was successful working with McDonough School, I think, does say something about how that's worked, that they have had a commitment to the truth. We began with they're coming up on their 150th anniversary, which is in fact this year. And so part of it was to have a book to celebrate that. Rightly so. Rightly so. It's a really interesting institution that's actually has a strong commitment to, even historically, to a certain type of social justice and uplift, especially for poor people from Baltimore. It gives out a lot more scholarship money than a lot of its peer institutions of that sort, an elite private school, I guess you'd say. And it's a pretty diverse place, as these places go. But it has a hard history, for sure. It has a hard history that includes having been working backwards, say, from the present, that had been a all-male military school. It had to go through the process of becoming a co-ed. It had been a segregated school from the very beginning. It had to go through the process of becoming an integrated school and gradually opening its doors to a much more diverse population and not even going through a period of perhaps more tokenist approaches in the 1950s and 60s to becoming a really much more diverse place. Which are difficult for places that have a history, and a history of segregation, and a history of all-male exclusive-ness. It had a history that goes back to its early headmasters in the 1870s and 80s, the first two of which were ex-Confederate Civil War officers who served under Robert E. Lee and then served as faculty members at Washington and Lee, or I guess Washington University under Robert E. Lee, and who came to Baltimore and became part of the lost cause mythology. In fact, became promoters of that mythology. They were serious academics too, but that was their cultural baggage. And that finally goes back to John McDonough himself, who died in 1850, but whose will left the money to found the school in Baltimore and also the New Orleans public school system, which up until very recently, many of its schools were named after John McDonough. That has changed. And there was, in fact, a bust memorial to John McDonough in New Orleans that now resides at the bottom of the Mississippi River as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's been a kind of opening of the doors and a surfacing of the history. John McDonough was born in Baltimore. He became an agent of William Taylor, who was a Baltimore-based merchant who had operations in Liverpool and in New Orleans. He went to New Orleans in 1790-something. He began, involved himself in the mercantile trade of the slave-produced commodities of sugar and cotton in New Orleans, soon recognized there were huge profits to be made in trading human beings, became a slave trader, eventually bought land, became a plantation owner, owned, over the course of his life, we've calculated about 200 enslaved people over the course of his life. All of that was sort of known, and this is the interesting thing about what's known, not known in narratives. You could even have found on the McDonough School website information about John McDonough being involved in slavery, right? But it wasn't really known. And so as we researched the history, it became apparent that the story was much more complex and much more involved and involved many more people than had been sort of admitted to. So there's always been this vague sense, well, yeah, I think he may have owned some slaves, but he was actually one of those kindly, it was that sort of kindly slave master narrative that had been promoted by the early headmasters of the kind of lost cause mythology. And so as all that surfaced, it became apparent that we couldn't just sort of deal with that in a single book. And that led to the second project that I'm now involved in, which is that the school would like a full accounting of the life of their benefactor, for whom the school is still named. And that's what we're working on now. It's of course now become a much more complex project that has to involve not only the life of John McDonough and his making of his fortune in New Orleans, but also the people that he owned and enslaved, and even his connections to the free black community of New Orleans, which he was also closely connected to. So that's the story that I'm now trying to tell, but I'm trying to tell it as I'm not just trying to, but I am telling it as a professional historian, not as a member of the school. And that, I think that impulse, I would say, that the school has had to do things this way, I think is to me, a very positive impulse, a very good way for institutions to go. It's good to have people on the inside, obviously, looking into the institution, but I think it's also good to engage with professional historians and people from the outside to look in. So that's the role I've been playing.
Monica, we all have, I think many of us would have some sort of familiarity with what's been going on with Hopkins. Of course, we recall work that Martha has done and the rest of it. So I'm thinking there's ongoing efforts in terms of the biography of Johns Hopkins himself, and then what, the history when it comes to the institution. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Certainly, as a public historian, I end up talking to a lot of audiences. So sometimes I end up talking to alumni or parents or students who don't know the story of Johns Hopkins and enslavement. But for this audience, I'm sure you are all very familiar with the work of Dr. Martha Jones. So what I'll talk a little bit about is how Hopkins Retrospective, the program I work for, fits into that work, and how we are sort of continuing to build upon and build with Martha in collaboration. So Hopkins Retrospective is a public history project that is nestled in the Special Collections and Archives Department at Hopkins. And this predates 2020 and the sort of revelation that Johns Hopkins was in fact an enslaver rather than an abolitionist, as was the myth. But I was not here yet. I got hired to expand this work. So it was a new position created to build out that at Hopkins. But my boss, Allison Seiler, who is a public historian and archivist, was there from the beginning in that work because the archives are where we're the first people alerted that there were these census records out there. And so we were sort of involved in that work from the beginning. Part of the role of the archives has been making those records available to the public. So for instance, we have an Omeka exhibit, a biographical archive that hosts the census records and all the different things, some of these pieces of evidence we find, because they wanted those things to be available to people to see with their own eyes, the sort of evidence of this big changed narrative. And I got hired as the historian and education coordinator for the project to really build out some of that research. So, and do a lot of sort of public sharing of that research as well. So in the last year, I've been really focused on researching the life of a man named James Jones. James Jones is the only name we know. We suspect he's one of the 4 enslaved men on the 1850 census, enslaved by Johns Hopkins. And that's because in the Baltimore Sun obituary, thinking about journalism, it mentions that Johns had purchased James Jones from a Mr. Taylor of Virginia and eventually emancipated him. And so I'm trying to figure out, is this true? And what can I learn about his story? And so I've gone to archives in Virginia because he was born in Virginia, which we've verified, in Winchester, where he was born, and in Charlottesville, in Richmond, and Martha and Ellie, one of her graduate students, has also gone to the archive in Richmond and looked at what would James Jones have life been enslaved by the Talos of Virginia? What was his childhood like in Virginia? And what were the connections between the Talos and Hopkins and Baltimore? And also thinking about, well, what was James Jones like once he was free? Which was, I suspect he was free. We don't have manumission papers because those weren't saved in the archives. So the silences constantly sort of haunt you in this work. But I suspect that he was freed around 1857 because that's when he gets married and when he starts to appear in the Baltimore City Directory, which normally would only be listing free Black people in the city. And so if he's on the 1850 census, then that's at least 7 years enslaved, right? Possibly much longer. And so, that's a big period of his life where he, had no autonomy in moving Virginia. Did he have family there? It's a question that's hard to answer, and it's hard to answer in part because going through the Talo family papers, the Talo family enslaved hundreds of people all across Virginia and Maryland. And I was looking for men named James who were the right age to be James Jones of Baltimore, and there are many men named James who are the right age to be James Jones of Baltimore. And one of the things I'm always haunted by is I'm looking for this one man and this one family. But every one of those men named James mattered, and their story matters. And so one thing you're always sort of grappling with here is you're trying to tell one man's story, but it's a lot of people's story and a lot of family stories. And so one thing that we've been really trying to do at Hopkins Retrospective is we're thinking about Johns Hopkins, the man, and his impact on Baltimore, but we're also trying to think about the families and the people affected by that, who lived that experience. And so that's a lot of the research focus that has been mine in the last year. And then we're also working in the archives to make sure that those archives are more accessible to other researchers who are doing this work. So Liz Beckman is the processing and research archivist for our project. She helps with the broad team of archivists do a reparative description audit in our archives. So we're trying to make visible a lot of the silences and a lot of the violence that you can find in the archives so that those are apparent to researchers, so sort of aid in all of our work in doing this. And then we're also trying to do more outreach and education about this. So we have another new colleague, Amber Miller. So we've had a lot of new additions to this work, who's developing things like tabling activities to go out with the students and get them involved and interested in this work. We have a fellowship program where we also help fund students who are interested in doing these hard histories of Hopkins, not just with slavery, but also in the 20th century and also the sort of more modern instances of harm that need to be repaired at Hopkins. So it's an ongoing project, and it's very much at Hopkins. There's a lot of community members doing this work. We obviously have Dr. Martha Jones as a lovely leader of this work. In the archives, we're doing this work. We also have Inheritance Baltimore and the Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship Program. And so there's been a lot of different pieces of repair work that we're trying to do at Hopkins. And so I'm just honored to be one small part of that.
I've had the experience recently as the opinion editor at the Banner of people calling and wanting to write about Johns Hopkins, either representing themselves or others or descendants. And it's an understatement, obviously, to say that Hopkins is such a powerful force, important part of the fabric of this community. So I'll start with you, Monica, about reaction inside the institution and from people in the community who have long associations with the institution and the university and alum and the rest. I just have been curious about how has that worked, and is there what have people expressed to you about how they feel about this really an earlier challenge? I mean, an earlier or the narrative that all of us here had believed and been told has been taken on the way it has been challenged. What kind of reaction has there been, and what's going on with that?
Yeah, I would say the reactions I get are incredibly diverse. And especially because I end up talking to people who have a lot of different relationships to Hopkins in this work. And so I end up talking to alumni and students and professors and community members. And even in all those categories, there are a wide variety of opinions about this work, depending on the positionality of that person. And so they've been really, it's really difficult for some people to kind of like grapple with this history. And so there is definitely in some corners resistance to changing those narratives and to grappling with the truth about racism in Baltimore at Hopkins and with Johns Hopkins. There's also the other side, which is the reactions of community members who are like, oh, we always knew, Like, there's plenty of people in Baltimore who, like, never had a glorified view of Hopkins as an institution, and they will tell you that, And so one thing that really has struck in me about reactions to these changing narratives is thinking about, for whom is this a change, That actually varies a lot depending on the positionality of the person. And so I think one of the challenges and one of the things I always try to take with me when I do that work is first sort of listening and talking to people about what their relationship with Hopkins is and thinking about where they start, and then I'm always telling the truth, but sort of how you navigate those conversations, try to get people to come along with you. There's sort of like people bring different things into those conversations. And so part of it is always listening to that and then sharing these truths with them.
Kenneth, as someone who's, as you described it, who comes from outside the institution, there are a lot of McDonough alums around here and people who have strong opinions about the school and its history and that kind of thing. What have you run into in terms of how they, their reaction to the work you're doing, or how the story has been told and should be told?
Right. So, in part, as my commitment to being the outsider, and I want to have that role. In other words, I want to be able to say that I'm looking at this not as a McDonough alum. I'm not looking at this as a McDonough teacher. I'm not looking at it as a McDonough employee. I have refrained from what I would think of as gossip about what's going on. So instead, in other words, I don't want to speak like what people might think from the inside, speculate on that, or say, well, this is kind of what I think might be happening. But what I can say is that I've obviously talked to a lot of McDonough alums, interviewed them as part of doing the history of the school, given presentations to audiences of teachers and administrators and students and alums. And so, of course, as you would expect, and I think very much with the Hopkins story, questions about what was known and what was not known have come out, right? And so when we gave a talk early about the uncovering of, much more difficult and hard stories about John McDonough as a slaveholder, the Black alumni basically said, essentially, well, it's about time. Like, like we knew this. And like one of the great stories about the school that's in the forthcoming school history is that in his will, his bequest to start the schools in New Orleans and in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins requested that on his birthday that the students would lay wreaths at his grave. And they did. And so if you've ever been to Owings Mills and you've seen the incredibly beautiful 800-acre McDonough School campus, very prominently in front of the main, the old Georgian building, is the statue of John McDonough, the white kind of marble statue of him standing with his hand on a book, right? And underneath are his remains, and which were moved from Greenmount Cemetery to the school. A very deliberate effort in the 1920s to disinter him and bring him to the campus. So for years and years, students would have to, on Founders Day, come and lay flowers at his grave. Now, you can imagine what happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s as the school became integrated. That African-American children, high school students, would have to perform this ceremony, as they did in New Orleans. It was finally abandoned, a while back. But that's the sort of story that I think, from many alums thought, well, yeah, that we honored him because he gave the money, and this was and I was a poor kid from Baltimore, from a family, from a Catholic family, and this is my one opportunity, and the school has really made me, and I've been successful. They did not, of course, understand what it meant to do that if you were a black student who knew or recognized, and even without necessarily knowing the level of detail that a professional historian working in the archives can bring to the story of John McDonough, but recognizing who this person was and having to perform that ceremony, right? And so those are the stories that really came out in the course of, we interviewed a wide variety of people, some of the teachers as well, who were sort of adept about understanding changing story of African American history, as well, became advocates for, recognizing the problems of simply honoring this person because he gave money or because he was such a benefactor or a philanthropist. And so I think bringing out those stories, especially through the oral history, was where I recognized that I think I guessed, but I really recognized, of course, there were multiple perspectives and voices and that wanted to be heard. That's the way I approached it, hearing all the voices. I certainly heard from older alumni who had gone in the days of when it was a military school, and the stirring, words of success that John McDonough, he wrote down these like 10 rules, I think called rules for success. Kind of a typical, as you'd expect, like work hard and do not waste time and, always apply yourself, including do unto others as you would have done unto you. He wrote that while, of course, he was owning, people. Wow. But again, that irony never, I think, hit home for people who maybe came to the school, white students who didn't really engage with the question about who this man was and how he had made his money. They thought, well, of course, he was an inspirational figure. So those stories came out too in the course of talking to them.
This is a William Faulkner quote. "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Michelle, I wanted to ask you about, I just don't. How's that mansion used today? Is it used for events or something, or what I've never been there. I went to my undergrad is at UMBC, so I know where the place is, but I've never been inside it or something. How is that used for events, or you say it's a beautiful facility? How's it used today?
It houses administrative offices, the honors program. Sometimes there are beautiful boardrooms with large, tables and beautiful high back leather chairs and whatnot that you can go and you can use the space for events if you want to rent them out. There have been weddings there, but it is an active use space.
I see.
There are
I see.
study halls there's study space it's really for the honor students mostly to come in there. Also, global studies is housed there as well. So it is being used, but I think it's important to talk about the importance of place when we talk about history, because a lot of times I'm always cognizant that as I walk through the world, everywhere I walk, there's history. Because I think a lot of us think, history is in a book, it's stale, it's static or what have you. But history is everywhere we walk. And it's important for students to know that the places that they're walking, if they're students at that campus, or even if they're visitors on that campus, that they need to understand the importance of the place that they are inhabiting and that they're walking through and that they're moving through, and that things happened here. Those of you, I don't know, if you ever get a chance, come visit the campus. It's a beautiful campus. It's in a lot of old stone structures in addition to the mansion, which are antebellum, which were built with enslaved labor, that are there, that house other aspects of administration for the campus. But there's also there's a wall with a large arch. And in that wall are small openings, like small windows. And when I take people on tours, I say, well, what do you think they were used for? Oh, ventilation, what have you. Well, they were used to, that wall was surrounding the whole property at one point, and it was used to keep the indigenous populations out. And it was also used to separate where the enslavers lived and where the enslaved would toil, so that there was this separation, but that there were holes for, originally for defense for, against indigenous populations, but also for surveillance. Because surveillance is a big part of the plantation system, is that you need to make sure that they're actually out there working and you have to watch them. And although there may be overseers, there were other forms of surveillance that occurred as well. So that you walk through, past this wall every day on your way to class, you need to understand, what was this used for? Who inhabited this space? How were they treated? What type of experiences did they have on a day-to-day basis? So can I throw back a quote to you?
Absolutely.
This is the
I'll
quote.
steal it.
Okay, you're gonna
I'll steal it and use it later.
This is Voltaire. So this is the quote I give my students on the first day of my history classes, and then have them explore what history means. And this is Voltaire: "History is the commonly agreed upon lie." And they all stare at me, lie? Well, what do you mean? Because we're here talking about things that are supposed to be truth. But how do we know? We weren't there. And even the people who were there have a lens, have an agenda. We can get as many primary sources as we want that are purported to be from that time period. But how do we know? And so we have to consider that even those primary sources, even those things that we are given as quote unquote truth, that we still need to question. We need to look at from various different perspectives. We need to analyze, we need to reinterpret what this could possibly mean, and not take for granted that this is the truth. And so, we try to unpack that on the first day of class. Like, what is history? Because again, I always try to say, we think we know what history means, and we have an abstract idea of what history is, but we need to think about, well, what's history versus memory? What's history, all of these different things that kind of fall under the umbrella of history that make history even harder, make it a harder thing to explore, a harder thing to kind of unpack, is that we have to take all of these things into consideration. And I think the difference about what's happening today in the last few years is that people are starting to understand that, and not just have that historiography that if you have a primary source, then you have the truth, that there could be more facets to that. So you can have that quote.
I see movement around. Are we getting to the point of we're going to be audience and online questions or?
And BT Dubs, check out the artist. Have you been? I can't keep my eye off of this. This is fascinating. I'm so excited by this. But just if you get a chance, just had to throw that.
I'm starting off the questions again. I'm sorry. My question is for Kenneth. If I understand, I should disclose, I actually have worked with Gonzaga for a few years, sort of on and off, mostly with Ed Donnellan, the phenomenal history teacher there, and had the privilege of going to the archive with some of his students in Georgetown. And so I followed this project for a few years. My question relates to, it's news to me that they decided to do a book, sort of, I knew they wanted to have a celebratory for the 150th work. So it's news to me that they are doing that, and then they've added this sort of accounting, if I understood your characterization. And so my question is, what do you think the risks are of having one piece that celebrates Gonzaga and then sort of segmenting the history of that institution to a completely separate work? Do you worry that the things that are celebrated in the first book are going to be abstracted from the exploitation that built them?
McDonough, right?
Well, not just McDonough, but the entire institution, the institutional history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is that even the celebratory history, right, is a hard history. That is to say, it tells some difficult truths, right, and certainly acknowledges the existence of John McDonough as the founder. So I think in some ways, and talks about the problems of Baltimore and Maryland as a state that was dominated in that period in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and early 20th century, by a kind of racist Democratic party. The first trustee of the McDonough bequest, one of them was Thomas Swan, who was a pro-slavery Maryland Democrat, one of the so-called redeemers. So that legacy, it's obviously John McDonough was long gone, but that legacy of how race got built into the history of the school is present in the history. So they didn't shy away. There's even some other, not so much relevant to this venue, but there's even some other difficult stories that they said, we don't want to cover anything up. We want people to know that we're going to tell even the less pleasant things. So it's not like, there's certainly things to celebrate. McDonough himself is a complex figure, right? He develops this manumission scheme for the people that he enslaves, in which I think about 70 of them were freed over the course of his life, and then after his death, he sends many of them to Liberia to become missionaries. He's very closely connected with the American Colonization Society. So he himself seems to have harbored, I haven't really decided yet which way to characterize him, but he writes on the one hand about how essentially sounds like there's no way we can ever be a multiracial republic. Free black people cannot live among white people. It's not clear he's saying that because he recognizes the racism of white people, or he himself is committed to a kind of Herrenvolk view of only the white race can be in the American Republic. But he also has very close relationships with the free black community. Very close relationships. He sends at least two of his enslaved people to be educated at Lafayette College. He was a committed evangelical Presbyterian, and Lafayette was a Presbyterian school. And his original bequest for the McDonough School says it will be a school for boys of all races and creeds. Now it doesn't carry out that mission until after 1954, but it's not like it's a simple good evil story either way, right? It's as you would expect, a narrative that I think someone said there's that kind of roller coaster aspect to it. It's not a simple linear narrative. It's a story that's had multiple facets, and I think both parts kind of reflect that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Amy Pohl. I work in the archives at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I was struck by both last session coming into this session, talking about how descendants and communities react and respond to hard histories, excuse me. And thinking about pulling it forward to more recent history where you have people still living who were involved and who have views of themselves and views of themselves as a group, right? Or, and I'm sorry, thinking specifically about different groups who were involved in Baltimore in blockbusting and development and the racism inherent in that. Also thinking about Hopkins and very recent lead paint poisoning studies that were done in the community. So you have people who are still around, who were there, who were present, who on a variety of fronts. And I'm just thinking about how that continues to complicate the story because the story's not over. And how to talk to those people who are very invested in telling the story, the story a certain way.
I guess I'll start since you mentioned Hopkins specifically. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I have certainly found in my work, not just at Hopkins, but also at UVA, where I was a graduate student in other places doing this work, that the closer you get to the present, the harder these conversations get, and that oftentimes, as a historian, I like chronology, right? So it makes sense to me to start at the beginning because those things inform the present. But I also think sometimes it's a little easier for institutions to tackle something that happened 150 years ago than 5 years ago. And so I think that's absolutely true. I think one thing I have found in history, and I have tried to convey to students too, is that most people don't think they're bad people. And that includes people who have done the worst atrocities in American history. Like slaveholders they have a story about themselves that they tell themselves that they think justifies what they do. We know that that is in no way at all a justification, but that is a hard thing in hard history's work, is when we're grappling with these stories of, how do people who tell themselves that they're good people do such terrible things? And that also lives on with our, current moment. How do people sort of justify doing things that are doing active harm? And how do they're sort of telling those stories? And so I think one thing I think that we have a sort of duty to do is to, if in our roles as, history keepers and history tellers end up in a room with the kind of folks who get to make those decisions, right? Like I'm a worker bee, I don't get to decide where Hopkins builds, but when we talk to those people to help share the stories of people who are affected by those current contemporary moments. If those important folks who make those decisions are sometimes interfacing with us and aren't always interfacing with community members, what can we do to get those community members in the room? And what can we also do to help tell those stories and filter them up? And use whatever power we can to sort of support that work. At Hopkins, I think often who's also leading this work is students. The undergraduate students and graduate students have done a lot of activist work to try to push the administration on certain issues that they really care about. And so part of our work as educators in the archives is also to support them, and that their voices are ones that our institutions really care about. And if you work in a museum or archive, the patrons, right, the students are like our patrons at Hopkins, are someone who influential people often care a lot about. And so we can try to support them in their work, in being involved in those conversations as well. And so that's part of, I think, our role here is to help elevate those stories and those voices and try to help them get in the room to think about some of the consequences of some of those modern policies that are often harder to talk about for institutions than the older past.
Can I add something? Is that okay? I think that's too the importance of oral histories today, because my students in my African American history class do oral histories themselves, and I tell them one of the main purposes is to look at that individual story and see how it stands up against the dominant narrative, because that dominant narrative is always going to be out there, but these individual oral histories from these individual perspectives so much flesh out and add the layers to the onion, if you will, of bringing out a fuller history of what that is. And that's talking about how do you merge together history and memory, because history is a discipline, and it's, we're trained to, be historians in this rigorous way, but memory is another piece of that. And there has to be a way that both of them are honored. both of them have to be honored, and there has to be a way to bring them together. And I think that that's one of the ways to take some of those narratives of people who may consider themselves to be, good, bad, whatever, players in whatever the story might be, and add that to the whole, the tapestry, add that thread to the tapestry, and flesh that out a little bit. So I just wanted to add that in.
I will always have a question. So y'all going to see me all day today. So I'm with the More Than a Fraction Foundation. We're a foundation of descendants, and majority of our work is with Virginia Tech University, because that was the plantation of which our family came from. So we've been working with Virginia Tech for about 5 years. And so we've done the narrative change. We've done the research. There have been many books, many papers, many websites, many conference presentations, many panels, and about a year and a half ago, Virginia Tech's President Sand was like, now what? And we were like, that's a really great question. So for about a year now, we've been working on the now what, and we realize when all of us are doing this work as historians, we can get really caught up into the documentation and the publication and the public availability of the information. And so for the past year, we figured out with Virginia Tech, the now what is how we take these two narratives that we got to run parallel on two different tracks to now run on the same train and the same track and become embedded within the culture of Virginia Tech without it just being about slavery or just being about racism. And so we ask ourselves weird questions like, how does the School of Business engage with this? How does the School of Agriculture engage with this? How does the School of just take another example, Appalachian Studies, which is easy because that's history, engaged with this. And so that's where we are with exploring about parts of the institution that is outside of the history department. How do they engage with this and run on track with it? And so I was talking to you yesterday about just working on some projects that seem minuscule, that doesn't seem to relate to what we're doing, but actually does when you look at the historical effects of the fact that slavery happened there and the push to get the Black community out of Blacksburg, which is where Virginia Tech is today. So my question for you is, have you hit that wall of once you do the narrative, you get the information out there after your research, now what?
So again, I can't say what next is for the McDonough School. I do believe, and I'm reinforcing what I heard from my colleagues up here, and going back to Faulkner's point about the past not even being past, I do think bringing out the history and documenting it and writing about it does have an effect on people, right? I mean, especially people who are deeply invested in the institution, say the alums of McDonough, even in ways they may not be fully aware, right? I think it does have an effect that it gives them a kind of possibility of a new narrative, one that doesn't necessarily destroy the things that they admire about the institution or remember about their own experiences there, but allows it to maybe almost in a subconscious way, recognize that their experiences were not all experiences, right? And that their experience, and that what historians are supposed to be able to do, right, is to both tell the narrative from the perspective of the actors of the time, but also to bring a kind of context and understanding that the actors of the time themselves are not aware of, right? And could not be aware of. They don't understand the ocean as fish that they swim in, right? And so I think if you do that, as good history does, I think it does give people a possibility without being angry or without being confrontational, or without rejecting their history, to sort of subtly rework the narrative in their mind. So I think that has a lasting effect. I think that might be a bit underappreciated. It doesn't have to necessarily reside in some material product. The other thing I think has now I will speak, and maybe this is true of Hopkins and elsewhere at Virginia Tech, is that by bringing the documentation forward and a possibility of a new narrative forward, it can now be embedded in the educational mission, right? And so already at McDonough School, some of the material we've used and found is being integrated into the classroom for the students, who of course are the next generation of those who will be the loyal alums of the school. And so that story can now be part of the history curriculum at McDonough, right? And that seems to have already happened. Obviously can't guarantee that will continue, but I think that's a really, I assume at Hopkins as well, that's a really good impulse to allow the students to explore the history of the institution that they're a part of, you know, in a very deep way. And so that's, I think, a really good lasting outcome of these types of projects.
Yeah, I was talking with Kira last night about some of these ideas, and I mentioned to her that what changed my outlook on history was my grandson. I have a 4-year-old grandson, and now I start to look at things, at the world through his eyes. And I want to know that the history that I'm working on, what difference does it make to him? What difference does it make to his life? And how is it applicable to even not just him, but the students and the other young people that come on the campus? And when you were talking about the different disciplines is hugely important. One of the things that we've been doing at CCBC is when I go in and talk to different classes, different disciplines, how can I make this history relevant to a math class? How can I make this history relevant to all the different classes? So I've gone in and I've given the history of this to a math class, and then what I do is I bring in some of the ledgers from the enslaved populations of bought and sold human beings, and let's think about the mathematics of this. How did this business run? I mean, the core principle was free labor. So if you're taking this free labor and you're purchasing it, but you still have to provide clothing and food and everything else, and let's do the mathematics of what it would have taken to run, to race horses at Saratoga or what have you, which is what one of the owners did. They were engaged in equestrian enslavement, and a lot of people don't know that during the 19th century, black men dominated the equestrian industry, the thoroughbred industry in the whole country. And that happened as well, where these horses were bred, trained, and were the jockeys. And so there are different ways to bring that in there. How do you purchase a horse? And everyone's looking up. So I was like, I want to see what y'all seeing. How do you do that? I did a presentation to a group of students who were ESOL students from all over the world. And I'm telling them this history, and they're shocked to know, the hard history of rape. And they couldn't wrap their mind around the idea of how could a person own a person. So this would impact different people in different disciplines, but also, I do talk to my grandson about certain aspects of his age appropriate. He's 4, and he wants to talk about Elmo or Baby Shark. But what, when I do take him to places, to give him a little bit of like what this would have meant at an age appropriate way. History is something I notice as students come in that they know less and less and less about. It's kind of scary how little these young people come in and know about their past, because to them it's like, well, it doesn't matter. It happened before I was born, so who cares? And so there has to be a way to make this relevant to them so that they can see, and then I'll shut up, that one of the things on our campus that we have is we uncovered that there was this long, narrow stone structure. Well, we found out it was a bowling alley. And so I take my students, I'm like, why do they have a bowling alley here? Well, wealthy people for leisure in 1850 or 1840 would bowl Well, who carried the balls back and forth? Who set up the pins? And how did the whole thing even work? And how does that relate to what you do for leisure today? How does your leisure experience differ from what a leisure experience might have been in 1840? So I think it's all about, we were talking about Afrofuturism last night a little bit. It's sort of futuristic. We have to think about young people and how this impacts them today in a world where they don't see the connections in many cases.
So we have time for one last question, and we'll take an online question.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm first of all need to shout out Jody Williams in the chat with her class, who's said Mark Williams is my father, and I'm watching with my students. So just wanted to shout that out. There's been a couple questions in the chat, and one of them you've already started addressing, which is sort of the question of goals, or the question of, once we've changed the narrative, what next? So, you've already addressed that in some way, but part of that that someone raised is also the question of trust with these institutions. And in particular, this was for Monica and Hopkins, the fact that, as you all have mentioned, at some point, these stories, for some people, aren't new, right? People are like, we've known this, right? And so how does an institution like Hopkins address the fact that, these records were open and this story could have been known and has been known? And how do you go about sort of addressing that and rebuilding trust going forward in this, in the making of this quote unquote new narrative that's not new for a lot of people? So.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I think about all the time in interacting with different folks in Baltimore when telling these stories. And I would say, my approach to it, which of course is, I'm sure I have more to learn. I hope I'll learn till the day I die, more ways to cultivate trust, is to listen and to take really seriously when people tell us those stories. When people tell me about their family and their relationship to Hopkins, when they tell me about development in East Baltimore, when they tell me about, what employment was like for them or what their experience at the hospital was like, to listen and take seriously that as true and as its own sort of hard history that the university needs to hear. And so I think being sort of honest about that and trying to let other folks sort of tell their own stories is really important. And I think that's especially important for a place like Hopkins where, and all universities, right, you have sort of these narratives we tell about ourselves. And I think it's important to, in my own work, try to pass the mic when I can. And so I think that that's a key way that we can earn trust. And I think the other thing is that being honest with ourselves that that's not gonna, we haven't earned it yet, like Hopkins has not earned the trust yet. I think we're working on it. We've done, it's a different institution than it was 20 years ago in a lot of ways, certainly in terms of just the demographics of the students who go there from number one is very different. But earning it takes time, and not like 6 months time, like generations time. And so being patient with that, and I think being not taking some sort of victory lap, but like continuing to learn and earn that trust. And I think that that is a long-term project. And so I think that that's something that, I hope Hopkins will continue to commit to long-term in building out these projects and thinking of them not just as like short-term, like, we write a book or we make a website and an exhibit, but as something that really needs to happen forever, that there's not going to be an end to this kind of work. And I think those kind of long-term commitments are what help build that trust over time.
Do we have time, or should I? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I suppose, again, working from the outside in, right, one thing I tried to stick to is the principle of symmetry. In other words, of course, there's a certain assumption there's a dominant narrative. I mean, I guess there is a dominant narrative in the history of the school. And so part of it was this resurfacing of other stories and voices. But I also tried to sort of take the approach that even those who are part of this sort of dominant narrative, that talking to them and interviewing them and doing oral histories with them was treated in the sort of the same way. Like in a sense, them telling their story about what they remember about being a student, say, or some other relationship to McDonough, that they're also telling it like anew, right? They're telling it's telling it again or telling it anew. That's going to also be part of a bigger picture story, so that I'm hoping it's not just like, well, here's the dominant narrative and here's like the revision of it, but rather there is no real dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is being broken down by having people who even imagine that they're part of the dominant narrative having the opportunity to tell their story, and me listening to it in exactly the same way, right? And I think that's an important process to go through for an institution that really wants to bring out their history, like in a really serious way. So, I mean, this is a small point, but the book that will appear, right, in one sense, is, as you said, kind of more of a celebratory history, but it has my name on it and it has the name of my co-author on it. It doesn't have the name of McDonough. I mean, it has the name of the school as the title, part of the title, but it's not like McDonough School's history. It's two historians, and it has a list of sources that we used and interviews that we did in the back, right? In other words, to establish that that you can write a history that maybe is an institutional history that's going to tell stories that the alums are going to see the beautiful pictures and read about things that, oh, I remember that, but that it actually can have historical, value and legitimacy. And I think that's another way that it could be done. I don't know if all institutions are willing to do that. I've worked on multiple institutional histories, but I think generally I go in with that idea that you will benefit from approaching it with this symmetrical, open, way that sticks to the values of professional history. That's my approach.
We have to stop already? We have to stop, Marlon? I'd really like to keep going. So glad to have been part of this. Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Mark, and everybody. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to lunch. Yes, for sustenance, but also for conversation. We are really thrilled to be partnering with the People's Supper for lunch today. So check your name tag. You have a table number. Kay Scary will be here from the People's Supper to get us started. We've got moderators at our tables, and I very much look forward to that. For our friends online, we will see you back at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our third roundtable. And again, thank you to this remarkable panel.